Our second scripture reading comes from the 19th chapter of the Gospel of John. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. And the soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they dressed him in a purple robe. They kept coming up to him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and striking him on the face. Pilate went out again and said to them, "Look, I am bringing him out to let you know that I find no case against him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and the police saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him." And the Jewish leaders answered him, "We have no law. We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has claimed to be the Son of God." Now, when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid than ever. He entered his headquarters again and asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate therefore said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have power to release you and power to crucify you?" And Jesus answered him, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to release him, but the Jewish leaders cried out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who claims to be a king sets him against Caesar." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside and sat on the judge's bench at a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of the preparation for the Passover, and it was about noon. He said to the Jewish leaders, "Here is your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Then he handed him over to be crucified. May God bless this reading. I forgot to mention in the announcements today that tonight we are having a gathering here in the sanctuary in memory of Lily Halligan. And so if you've been looking for a place to come and grieve together in community, 5 p.m. tonight here at the church will be a place where you can come and join together. As we start our sermon today, though, we are jumping back into the Gospel of John. And in particular, in the book of John, and during Lent, we are making our way to the cross. We've been talking about this contrast between Jesus and Pilate, Jesus and the Empire of Rome, of which Pilate is a representative. And today, this contrast between these two powers is made in an incredibly stark way. Because Jesus is dressed in purple. They say they put a purple robe on him, which is the color of royalty, and he has a crown placed on his head. It is a crown of thorns, but you get the image. And it's clear from this story that the soldiers and Pilate are mocking Jesus. They're trying to make a joke at his expense. But I wondered as I read this passage if the gospel writer isn't doing something subversive here. You know, this image of Jesus in the robe with the crown on. It is an over-the-top image of a king. And it is so absurd that you would refer to this man as a king, this man who has been beaten and prepared for death, that it would be completely foolish to ever consider worshiping him. And yet, that's what his followers do. It's like Pilate stands there before the people and he says, "Here is your king," mocking him, making fun of him. And the listeners of the gospel and the earliest followers of Jesus go, "Yeah, that's him. That's our king." It reminded me of there's this genre of literature and movies that I've grown to love. Kind of the literature, the movies that descend from what's called the theater of the absurd. English teachers know what I'm talking about. In film, it's best represented by a movie that came out this year called Begonia, which is by the Greek filmmaker Yorgos Lanthimos. And his movies tend to play on this idea of the absurd, on images that do not make sense, that are way over the top and bombastic. I don't want to talk about Begonia because it hasn't been out that long, and I don't want to give you a spoiler alert. I want to talk about one of his earlier films. In 2015, he released a film starring Colin Farrell that was called The Lobster. And the premise of the movie is this. In the world in which this movie takes place, when you end a relationship, you have to go live in a hotel with other single people, and you have 45 days to find a new partner. And at the end of the 45 days, if you have not found a partner, you get transformed into the animal of your choice. And so the title of the movie comes from David, played by Colin Farrell, who keeps telling people that he's decided he wants to be a lobster if he doesn't find a partner at the end of 45 days. He also shows up, by the way, with a pet Labrador retriever that is his brother. So this movie is completely over the top, right? Like, this is not the way the world works. And yet, in presenting all of this imagery that is absolutely absurd, Yorgos is trying to make comments. He's trying to make a commentary on modern society. In The Lobster, he's really referring to the sort of modern trends of dating. It has been a while since I have dated, but the last time I dated was on the sort of beginning edge of online dating. And his critique is that, first of all, we make it so much pressure for single people to find partners in our society. And so he's commenting on that pressure that people feel. But he's also commenting on the ways in which we reduce dating down to superficial details about people. And in the movie, there are all these ways in which the people who run the hotel are trying to get you to find people who might be a match for you. And there's all this pressure and all this, you don't want to be turned into a lobster or a Labrador retriever, right? Right? And the point is that he makes this absurd movie that is so over the top to comment on this thing that we're all sort of familiar with. And his other movies do this too. Begonia, great movie. But it's absurd. Doesn't really make a lot of sense. So this movie, The Lobster, isn't talking about dating, but it is talking about dating. So I've always looked at this scene in the Gospel of John where Jesus is beaten and flogged, where he is mocked and where he is crowned, as this kind of subversive, absurd scene. Here is your king. Nobody would possibly choose Jesus in this moment as their king. But it is just that absurdity that becomes a critique of Rome itself. So think about if you're an early follower of Jesus. Jesus comes presenting a kingdom that is radically different than the kingdom that he is in. We've talked about the focus on abundance and on welcoming, on healing. This kingdom that is different than the power and the might of Rome. And it is a threat to Rome. And so the empire does what it does with folks who are a threat. It crucifies Jesus. Crucifixion was not an uncommon punishment in the ancient world. Crucifixion was the punishment reserved for people who threatened Rome. So basically, if you led a revolt, they would crucify you and leave you on the side of the road so that all of your followers saw you and knew if you did this thing, this could happen to you. There was a revolt in Judea the year Jesus was born, and the story goes that they lined hundreds of people up on crosses along the sides of the road leading in the town as a warning. This is what will happen to you if you do this. It's what some in the U.S. refer to as a deterrent when talking about capital punishment. So the followers of Jesus in this story ought to be afraid. And they are at first. But then Jesus is resurrected. And the symbol of the ultimate power of the empire, the ability to kill those who dissent, becomes the ultimate symbol of victory over the powers of the world. It's like they're asking themselves, what's the worst that Rome can throw at us? Crucifixion? Well, then we will celebrate that as the greatest thing that can happen to us. After all, it is the event that leads to resurrection. Jesus defeats the power of the world meant to scare us into submission. It would be absurd to worship the one who was crucified. And that becomes its power. So when a people is under the threat of empire, the cross becomes the symbol of victory over the forces of this world. But there's another side to this. For those of us who enjoy a more comfortable place in the powers of the world, who enjoy more privilege, the cross can become something else in its absurd imagery. It becomes a kind of corrective. It is a way of recalibrating whether or not we are on the path of Jesus. Because one way to think about what the cross is all about is that it shows God's solidarity with the suffering of this world. God becomes one of us, and not just one of us, but one of those who are humiliated, who are beaten, who are tortured. The liberation theologian John Sobrino uses the language of Jesus and says that in Jesus, God was showing God's solidarity with what he calls the crucified of the world, those who have been victims of violence and torture. So that when we proclaim Jesus as Savior, when we proclaim him as King, the question we can ask is, well, what is our allegiance to? The powers of this world or the powers of those who have been crucified? And to say that your allegiance is to the crucified of our world would be, well, not really common sense. Nobody sets their alliances up with folks who haven't been treated well. But in turning our attention to what the German theologian Jürgen Moltmann calls the crucified God, well, we are called to adjust our allegiances and our concerns. And for some in the world, this will seem absurd. After all, you are supposed to worry about your own success and well-being. You're supposed to be doing all you can to get ahead yourself. That's what the world asks of us. But Jesus wants something else, to be in solidarity with those who suffer. Now, the story goes a little bit deeper than that, because if we're all honest with ourselves, we think that we're doing that. I think that I am doing that my allegiance and everything I do in life is to Jesus of Nazareth. But one thing going on in this story is something that I try to remember, which is that the gospel is not the story of how some people got it right and other people got it wrong. Everybody in the story of Jesus leading up to the cross misses it. Who in this story hasn't failed on some level? Judas betrays Jesus. Peter denies Jesus. The Jewish leaders hand him over to be killed. Pilate mocks Jesus. The masses who gather before Pilate deny him as king and announce him he ought to be crucified. And it is a reminder, if you go back to the very first chapter of John, we read that he was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. So there is this sense from the very beginning that those of us who find ourselves in this world will live with a sense of confusion, what the gospel calls darkness, and we are prone to wandering off the path. And we ought to be willing to admit when we are wrong, and probably just as quick to offer forgiveness for others when they are wrong. Like, for instance, when for decades social justice leaders lifted up a leader who, it turns out, was committing atrocious crimes against others, including those closest to him. We can all be wrong and lionize the wrong people. We all miss things, and we will need to be put back on the path. And it happens to the best of us. The theologian James Cone, who is most famous for being what is considered the father of black liberation theology, at the end of his life wrote a book that he called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And it's one of his most personal books. It was written right before he died in 2011. And in it, he wonders why all of the great American theologians, the theologians that he studied with, the theologians that trained pastors throughout U.S. history, most particularly he lifts up Reinhold Niebuhr, who beyond being a theologian is an ethicist that Barack Obama called his guiding star. And Cone wanted to know why all these great theologians could not see the similarities between the cross of Jesus and the lynching tree used in so many communities to kill black people in the U.S. And he wondered, what if those who taught ministers would have been able to see the similarities between these two devices of torture? Would that have changed the way so many Christians in the U.S. understood racism and the violence of the systems across the U.S.? But they didn't see it. And so Cone asked the question, what were they missing? Theology, by the way, is meant to correct our teachings. And so Cone was both critical of these teachers, but also was trying to offer them a corrective. What if we looked at this differently? Because they needed a corrective. They needed a recalibration. Are we living up to the ideals of the gospel of Jesus? Remembering back to that first chapter of John, we remember this, that while we live in darkness, confusion, while we don't always quite know the right way, Jesus is the light. And to proclaim him as king is to recalibrate what matters in our lives. And that's exactly why we tell the stories of the gospel, of the people of God. It's why we gather here every Sunday. I can remember when I was a kid, every day in school, they have you stand up and say the Pledge of Allegiance to the American flag. And I just wonder if when we gather here in church, we're not doing something very similar, pledging allegiance to the kingdom of Jesus Christ, knowing that we may need to recalibrate as we go, knowing that we may need to regroup and reassess where we are at. And it's partly because of the absurdity of the story. We pledge allegiance to the one who was brutally murdered by the empire of his day, to the one who was beaten and mocked, the one who was a victim of state-sponsored violence, the one who was meant to be an example to all those who proclaimed this other kingdom to keep it to themselves. In pledging allegiance to Jesus and his kingdom, we are making this absurd statement that this is what power looks like. The kind of power that lays down its life for another, the kind of power that believes in abundance and not scarcity, the kind of power that can only be defined as love, as true love, as what the Greek calls agape, the deep love, the love for others as for oneself. So when we look at Jesus and we recognize the absurdity of this love that we have chosen to follow, we ought to also recognize the places where we are in need of change in our own lives. Because inevitably, we will have turned our back on some of the most absurd parts of it. And so how is it that we recalibrate our own lives towards the gospel? When we think about our own allegiance to the one who was crucified, who was tortured, who was mocked, who was dressed in purple robe and a crown of thorns, how would we think differently about the world? About homelessness and housing, about how resources are allocated, about criminal justice and capital punishment, about war. If our ultimate allegiance was to Jesus and his kingdom, are there things we would do differently? After all, the story is absurd to proclaim this one as the king, as God. But the answer is always that we do. See, Pilate thinks that he is mocking Jesus. We know he's right. Here is our king, the one dressed in purple and hung on a cross. Amen.